Okay, so it's not often that we do current affairs political content on this channel. It's very rare that we do. But the RAAC concrete scandal is a massive talking point right now. It's dominating the news headlines in the UK. But this is not just a UK problem. A lot of Europe has used RAAC concrete. There's a lot of buildings that still contain RAAC concrete, not just in Europe but across the world. It was seen as a cheap, quick replacement for all the buildings damaged in World War II and all the post-war boom development that we had globally. It was cheaper to manufacture and put the buildings up, and speed of construction. It was a cheaper version of concrete. It's a lower grade of concrete, but there was a necessity to use it in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even into the early 90s. It was still being used in construction. The problem is the way the current government under Rishi Sunak here in the UK has handled the crisis, and especially in the education sector, both state and private, because so many schools were built using RAAC concrete or were modified using RAAC concrete following the Second World War and in the building boom of the 50s, 60s and into the 90s. Now, officials were first made aware of the flaws in this concrete and the issues with this concrete back in 1994. Building surveyors found some buildings, were unsafe. We've known for 29 years that there's an issue. That means a lot of prime ministers, a lot of education secretaries, a lot of health secretaries, defence secretaries, home secretaries, development secretaries in government have been aware of this. Local councils have been aware of this. Building inspectors have been aware of this for the best part of 3 decades. The way the government's handled it is a problem. The issue is how many buildings are still standing that contain RAAC concrete. And we have to go back to the end of the war and then the post-war building boom and the various housing, building booms that we've had in development and redevelopment of town and city centres since 1945. RAAC concrete was used because it was cheaper than regular concrete. It was easier to put buildings up. It was quicker. There was a need and a necessity to rebuild Europe and Asia following World War II. It's also used in those countries that weren't impacted, including North America, South America. It's been used all over the world. It was a cheap, affordable building material. Problem is, it's weaker than higher grades of concrete. It's really porous, it's lighter, and it crumbles really easily should it start to degrade. All concrete degrades at different rates depending on the grade. This is one of the lowest grades of concrete you can get. The issue is how badly the current government has dealt with it. But as I said, they first realised in 1994 there were flaws with using this concrete as a building material for various reasons. And it's not just schools in the UK that are impacted. But I do remember as a kid going to school, we had to use the porter cabins occasionally, those temporary porter cabins that are meant to last like 5-10 years, because buildings were being upgraded. In the 90s, I went to a further education college, which is a step between secondary school and university. That was a concrete tower block, basically, that contained RAAC concrete. Now, it no longer exists. It's been demolished and replaced with a brand new, more modern building. But I went to a further education tertiary college that was built with RAAC concrete, and it had a lot of building problems and was constantly, the maintenance guys were constantly busy finding faults in the building. The lifts didn't work half of the time, for example. But because of the necessity of using it, we don't know how many buildings actually in the country contain RAAC concrete, how many housing extensions contain RAAC concrete. So it's not just in the public sector where this is an issue. We know that Ealing Crown Court, for example, has been shut for up to 9 to 10 months while emergency repairs take place. It's affecting the court system. So what do we know? Well, 94 till now, how many prime ministers, how many home secretaries, how many education, health, Secretary of State for the Armed Service, MOD, all the various government departments. I mean, that means John Major has been Prime Minister, Tony Blair has been Prime Minister, Gordon Brown has been Prime Minister, David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss doesn't really count, and now Rishi Sunak. So there's a lot of Prime Ministers who've been in number 10 who have been clearly, with their government departments, have been fully aware of this situation for the last 3 decades, and not enough action has been taken, and now we're at panic stations. But I remember as a kid and as a teenager going to school and college, buildings that were built using RAAC concrete were already starting to fall apart. I remember when I was at school taking my GCSEs, the building where I had to have my history, geography, and language lessons was not long due to be condemned. It was condemned not long after I left the school, and it was in a poor state of repair. That was also where our school theatre was. It was slipping down the hill, so it was badly sited to begin with. But you could see that it was made out of a very cheap form of concrete that was crumbling. And this is back in the 2000s. It's about 20 odd years ago. So this is not a new issue. The problem is how successive governments have failed over a long period of time to address the issue. It's now at a time when we've got a very unpopular government where anything could be turned into a scandal or a crisis, where the media are going after the government a little bit, but many successive governments and many parliaments have failed to deal with this issue. And as I say, it doesn't just impact the public sector and government-owned buildings, it impacts the private sector as well. There will be shops, offices, factories, warehouses, houses, all impacted, blocks of flats, you name it, impacted by the use of this cheaper building material. So it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of engineering to fix the problem. Obviously, the education system is one of the most impacted areas, but hospitals, police stations, fire stations, a lot of government buildings are also impacted. It's going to impact the day-to-day running of government departments. It's going to impact the day-to-day running of local councils, so local government level, because a lot of their council offices were built with this stuff. There's a lot of buildings in the private sector that people using those buildings may not even know that they have this poor quality, lower grade building material in it. There's a lot of countries in earthquake zones outside of the UK who have also used RAAC concrete, and then we wonder why buildings collapse in earthquakes. Look what happened in Turkey. The building standards were deliberately weakened to, again, explosive growth, build quickly. Buildings that should have withstood those earthquakes collapsed like Jenga towers. When you move too many blocks out, they collapsed like a house of cards. They were very badly built using this cheap RAAC concrete. So there's going to be a lot of heads have to roll for this. It is very troubling, but the fact that RAAC concrete was discovered back in the early 90s to be a very flawed building material tells you we've had 3 decades to fix this. And 3 decades to invest in repairing, refurbing, or replacing buildings that contain this building material. And there's been times when there hasn't been a lot of spare cash in the public purse. That happens, but this shouldn't have got to this stage. We should not be in this stage right now, where a huge proportion of schools, hospitals, and other government buildings are partially or fully closed, and lots of private buildings where companies and people live, they don't even know how many buildings are unknown with this. I mean, building surveyors are going to have their work cut out. The construction industry needs to be looked at because they advocated using this building material. So the building industry, the construction industry, a lot of spotlight needs to go on them. And a lot of questions need to be asked about successive governments and what ministers and civil servants knew for 30 years. This didn't happen overnight. This isn't just, we found a building that's a little bit unsafe. Now, thankfully, only a handful of buildings have seen structural failures here in the UK. But let's say there's an earthquake in Italy or Spain or Greece where they've also used this RAAC concrete, and tens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of people are killed and injured because a building is not up to building regulation and standard, which is a massive problem in parts of Europe where lots of illegally extended buildings or buildings that were built using this material, again, still stand. It is deeply troubling. This is more than just a UK issue, and we'll have to see what the aftermath is. But I can see heads rolling in government, I can see heads rolling in the civil service, and I can see a massive investigation into the construction industry, and we need and potentially a strengthening of building regulations, not a weakening. And what we've seen over the decades is the building regs have actually been weakened. We are building houses, offices, factories with loads of defects in them. which shouldn't be the case. The building standards have got worse because there's an expediency to build quick. And we've seen all sorts of problems. We've obviously seen the Grenfell Tower fire with the cladding. We've seen other building fires of really recent construction going up in flames and having structural issues. There is a crisis in the building industry, in the private sector. Heads will have to roll. But we'll see how much it ends up costing the UK taxpayer here in the UK. Other countries are going to have to go through the same thing. They're going to have to find these buildings and decide whether they're worth trying to repair and stabilise or completely demo and rebuild. And it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to cost a lot of money for the private sector and the public sector. So we'll see what happens, but we should not have got to this stage. We've had 29 years to make the changes necessary to building code, which we've not. We've gone the other way. Actually assess these buildings. We don't know how many buildings in this country have RAAC concrete. God knows, it could be in the tens of thousands. People's lives could actually be at risk if a building suddenly collapses. People may be forced out of their homes because the buildings they live in are unsafe. Businesses may be forced out of their premises because the buildings they are using are unsafe, yet they don't even realise. So we'll see what happens, but that's my thought on it. It's a scandal. We should not have got this far. It should have been dealt with at a much earlier date. And heads will roll in both the public and private sector, I have no doubt. So there we go. Thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts in the comment section below, and I'll have some more content for you very, very soon.